Hello, everybody. We are, of course, talking about the Great Depression, and today we'll talk about the causes of the Depression. I will tell you up front that a big misnomer or misunderstanding about the Great Depression is that the stock market crash alone caused the Great Depression. That's not really the case. Usually, what happens is the stock market is an indicator of things to come, or it's in reaction to something that's already happened. So, in 1929, I like to think of it this way. If you think of a rock in your hand, okay, and you throw that rock into the air as high as you can, pretty good sized rock, and it lands in the middle of a lake. Okay, if that rock, when it hits the middle of the lake, of course, it's going to make a splash, right? Well, that splash, though, doesn't affect the outside, the shores of that lake or pond immediately. It takes time. But eventually, the waves from that rock hitting the water in the middle of the lake will make its way in some way, shape, or form to the shore. That's what happened when the stock market crashed. Okay, most people, like my grandparents, didn't have a dime to invest in the stock market. So it didn't really affect them right away, but over the course of time, the ripple effect from that rock hitting in the middle of the pond is what caused or helped cause the Great Depression. Okay, so that rock, by the way, really only symbolizes 4 million Americans. Okay, there were only 4 million Americans that had money in the stock market. There was over 100 million Americans at the time, like 120, 125, something like that. Okay, so that crash didn't directly cause the Great Depression. Okay, so here's a picture of Wall Street on the day that the stock market crashed, October the 28th of 1929. And it wasn't all in one day. It kind of had some days when it went up and then it would go down big time, then it would come back up. But this day is when it was like, okay, this is bad, right? So when I show this picture with the stock exchange behind it there in the background, that's the one with all the columns. They said on this day you could hear people's feet shuffling outside. There was no noise in this picture, like nobody was saying anything. And it was just silence because everybody knew how bad it was. Okay. Uh, this is weird, right? This is super strange. Well, in 1929, Herbert Hoover, in March of 1929, Herbert Hoover was inaugurated the president of the United States, right? And remember, we had Harding, heart attack, and then Coolidge, and now we have Hoover. He, in his speech, right, in his inaugural speech, like we just saw from President Biden a few weeks ago, he said, by the end of my time in office, there will be a chicken in every pot. What that meant was that everyone will have food to eat and it will be great. The stock market hadn't crashed yet. Things were good. And he was promising that the prosperity was going to be even better. Okay. And like you guys saw in the stormy weather video, that bonus army march and the reaction to that in the beginning well, it wasn't the beginning, but during Hoover's administration, like it wasn't good. Like he didn't have a good response to it at all. Okay, so he promised great things to people in March of 1929, and then in October of 1929, the stock market crashes. So that was a huge problem. Okay, and like I said earlier, a kind of an indicator of things that were going to come. Okay, so this is the stock market itself. This is what it used to look like. They used to trade with those papers that you see on the floor. Of course, today it's all done digitally. So this is a crash, right? And if you look closely at that picture, it's a fake picture, but that's a crash. These are people, right? We talk about the social effects of this. These are pea pickers, right? Or migrant farmers, not necessarily pea pickers, but the migrant mother was a pea picker. So these people, right, were before this even started, were in a bad way, and this just made it worse for people. This is one of the things that showed some promise, right? Somebody actually building something during the Great Depression. This is the Empire State Building in New York City that was built during the Great Depression. This is the Dust Bowl, which we'll talk about. I think it's next week. And this just added to the problems of the 1930s. You know, 2020 was terrible, and everybody's like, "Oh, it's so 2020. Like 2020 is terrible." Well, the whole Great Depression was like that. Like it was like that from roughly 1930 to 1938 or 39. Where bad things were happening, and this happened in 35 and 36 in the Midwestern states, including Illinois, was partially affected. Here's another picture of what the Dust Bowl looked like, right? That's literally a cloud of dust that was coming their way. This is a picture of African American sharecroppers somewhere in the South Well, good news, right, when it comes to the Great Depression is it didn't really affect these people. The bad news is because they were already in a depression, because they, were discriminated against, and they were literally held back in their job. Like, as a sharecropper, they weren't going to make enough money even in the prosperity of the 1920s, to break out of living in the conditions that you see here. Okay, so when the 1930s hit for African Americans that were sharecroppers like this, it was like, okay, well, this is more of the same. Okay, but it did kind of identify everybody else with what was going on. Okay, so a healthy economy, question mark, right? We had great prosperity in the 1920s. Stock prices had almost quadrupled. So if you think about the calculator, the interest calculator that I gave you, man, your numbers would have been skyrocketing in the 1920s, going up crazy fast. Okay, companies started to practice what they called welfare capitalism. They would raise their wages when they made more money. They'd give their employees more benefits like vacations and health plans. They were passing this along, and it was great. But remember, the business of America is business. That was Harding and Coolidge's viewpoint. So they basically just said, "Hey, this is up to you guys. Whatever you do, you do." So if they overextended themselves as a business, well, that's their fault. And so when the economy comes crashing down in 1929 and 1930, those benefits, those vacations, those health plans, and all that stuff that the companies needed back, well, it's too late, right? Those things had already been spent, and they didn't really add to the bottom line. So it made it even worse, okay, because there were no regulations, and so they had extended themselves too much. So don't be confused. Things like vacations and health plans at work are good things, but when the companies are spending too much and then they get caught in a little trap when they've spent too much, that's a problem. Okay, so margin. This is something I did not explain the other day during the stock thing, but margin means that you can basically borrow money to buy stocks, which is great, right? So think about it right now. If you guys could borrow $10,000 to invest in the stock market, and then, think about a stock market game, it's $25,000, right? So if you could really just borrow that and it wasn't your money and you invested and it goes up, great. The problem is, what if it goes down? And then it really becomes a problem is, what if it goes down big time, like it all crashes, and then you owe all this money? Well, now you owe the money that you borrowed from a bank. You can't repay the bank. Now what happens to the bank? Now, for you and I, nothing happens to the bank, right? Today, the bank seems safe. Like there's no danger of losing your money in the bank. That wasn't the way that it was in 1929 and 1930. Okay. And we'll get to that when we talk about the New Deal, but today we have the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, where your money is guaranteed in the bank. It wasn't that way in 1929. So if you knew that your bank had foreclosed on some loans and they were losing money because of the loans, they're using your money. Okay, you better get to the bank and get your money out before the bank goes bankrupt, because guess what? If the bank shuts down and your money was in there, it's over. You lost all your money. Okay, that's really hard for us to understand today, because that's not the way it is today. That money today is guaranteed through the FDIC. It wasn't that way in 1929, 1930, and all throughout the Great Depression. Okay, economic danger signs. So there's 4 biggies, okay, and they go by letters instead of numbers. But the first one, A, is uneven prosperity. There were 200 companies that had half of the business in the United States. 80% of Americans had no savings. Okay, that's a problem. Okay, because they're literally living paycheck to paycheck, which is fine as long as there's always a paycheck. But when the paycheck goes away, then what do you do? Okay, well, everybody always says, well, the paycheck will never go away. Well, when all of a sudden the paycheck does go away for 1/4 of America, or sometimes even 1/3 of America, that's a problem. Okay, that's a problem. So you got the people at the top that got all kinds of money. You got a lot of people in the middle, right? But even the people in the middle are living paycheck to paycheck, and 80% of families have no savings. So you should look it up and see what the percentage of people today that have no savings are, and you'd be surprised. It's actually gotten a little bit better, but it used to be close to this number, okay, where people were without any savings because they just spent their money on everything. So that's a problem, though. That's the uneven prosperity, right? It is not a good thing economically. Okay, the next one is buying on credit. We talked about that in the 1920s unit. One of the new things was advertisement and buying on credit, right? Credit companies. that were set up. That was a problem then, and it's still a problem now. It's like the good debt and the bad debt from the millionaire lesson, right? Interest is great. It's awesome if it's working for you. If your interest, your money is making interest for you, that's how in that little calculator, all of a sudden you have $1 million because, well, not all of a sudden, but over the course of time, you have $1 million because the interest keeps piling up for you. Okay, but it also works the other way around, where if you buy on credit and you have to pay interest on that credit and then you can't pay it off, then that credit starts to bury you. And if you can't ever pay it off, the company that you bought from now doesn't have any money, or the bank that you borrowed money from goes out of business. And the people that had money in that bank lose all their money. Okay, this is a compounding problem. Okay, so this is definitely people buying too much on credit. And again, today, in today's world, this is a huge problem, people buying too much on credit. Okay, it's a big, big problem. And that is a problem that you need to avoid. If you can't afford it in your life, don't buy it. Okay, put it off until you can pay for it yourself. There are some exceptions, like a house, maybe even a car. Okay, but credit cards, terrible. They're terrible. Like I told you, in the next 5 years, they're going to ask you, credit card companies will be all over you to get you to do this because they think you're dumb and you don't understand this. Well, you know now, don't do it. Okay. All right. The other thing is the stock market. People try to get rich quick. The other day, I told you 3 words and I made a huge point about pay yourself first are the most 3 important words that you'll ever hear come out of my mouth. Okay. It's still the same. Pay yourself first, pay yourself first, pay yourself first. That's very important. But if you try to get rich quick, okay, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It may work for, you might be, oh, my cousin Joe, him and his wife, they had a program, right? Well, whatever. Okay, maybe every once in a while somebody gets rich quick. But usually if they do, they lose it quickly, just as quickly, or they go to jail because it's illegal. It takes time for these things. Even the multi-millionaires you see today, they didn't get rich overnight. It took them time and an idea and an investment and hard work in a business. Okay. So people in the stock market try to get rich quick, and that's speculation, right? Speculation is literally a word, a high risk for a high possible gain, but it's also, you can lose a lot, right? And so people in the stock market, they gambled and they lost. Okay, they tried to get rich quick. Not what I was telling you the other day. My thing for you the other day about how to become a millionaire had nothing to do with quickness. Okay, it was investing over the long haul, okay, for many, many years. And the longer you do it, because the earlier you start it, the more money you have. Okay, getting rich quick, it's rare. It's extremely rare. And if somebody comes to you with a plan, hey, we're going to get rich really quick, just ignore them. You don't want to listen to that because it isn't going to work. Okay, so here's the other problem. Whenever we got to a point, people started to freak out, okay, and panic. And literally panic is a term, kind of like speculation, right? It's a term. And a panic in the Great Depression was everybody went to their bank to get their money at the same time, because the way banks work is you put your money in the bank, and then the bank takes your money and loans it out to other people. Well, if other people can't repay the bank, well, then that's a problem, because the bank goes bankrupt and you lose the money that you put in there. Okay, which again, today, this can't happen because of the FDIC, right? But I'm going to play this video clip from you. It's from one of my favorite movies called It's a Wonderful Life. He was a banker, okay, and he had all of his family finances and everything tied up in this savings and loan, or building and loan, they called it. So people trusted him. They loved him, and they would come to him to get loans, and he would give loans to everyone. And so everybody came to him, right? And that's all fine and dandy as long as everything's going okay. But boy, when things break, that's bad. And so everybody runs to the bank at the same time. That's called a panic. So here's what it looked like. Wrong button.
Don't look now, but there's something funny going on over there at the bank, George. I've never really seen one, but that's got all the earmarks of being a run.
Okay, so he just got married. Him and his wife are going on their honeymoon. And the cab driver just told him what was going on at his bank.
Just remember that this thing isn't as black as it appeared.
And you can see the signs in there. Own your own home, right? He's loaning money out to these people.
I just talked to old man Potter, and he's guaranteed cash payments to the bank. The bank's going to reopen next week.
But, George, I got my money here. Did he guarantee this place?
Well, no, Charlie, I didn't even ask him. We don't need Potter over here.
And I'll take mine now.
No, but you're thinking of this place all wrong, as if I had the money back in a safe. The money's not here. Well, your money's in Joe's house. That's right next to yours. And in the Kennedy house, and Mrs. Maitland's house, and 100 others. You're lending them the money to build, and then they're going to pay it back to you as best they can. Now, what are you going to do? Foreclose on?
So do you see how that works? You put your money in the bank uses your money to loan out to other people. Okay. And as long as those other people repay all their debt, which he knows all these people, right? So you kind of owe it like to your community to repay, right? Well, now everybody's running to the bank in a panic to get their money, right? And remember, he's supposed to go on his honeymoon. Okay. So him and his wife have been saving up for a long time to go on their honeymoon.
On them?
I got $242 in here, and $242 isn't going to break anybody.
Okay, Tom. All right. Here you are. You sign this. You get your money in 60 days.
60 days?
Well, now, that's what you agreed to when you bought your shares.
Tom, did you get your money?
No.
Well, I did. Old man Potter will pay 50 cents on the dollar for every share you got.
50 cents on the dollar?
Yes, cash.
Well, what do you say?
No, Tom, you have to stick to your original agreement. Now, give us 60 days on this.
Okay, Randall.
Are you going to Potter's?
Better to get half than nothing.
Randall, wait a minute. Wait. Now, listen to me. I beg of you not to do this thing. If Potter gets a hold of this building and loan, there'll never be another decent house built in this town. He's already got charge of the bank. He's got the bus line. He got the department stores, and now he's after us. Why? Well, it's very simple. Because we're cutting in on his business, that's why. And because he wants to keep you living in his slums and paying the kind of rent he decides. Joe, you had one of those Potter houses, didn't you? Well, have you forgotten? Have you forgotten what he charged you for that broken-down shack? Here, Ed, you remember last year when things weren't going so well and you couldn't make your payments? Well, you didn't lose your house, did you? You think Potter would have let you keep it? Can't you understand what's happening here? Don't you see what's happening? Potter isn't selling, Potter's buying. And why? Because we're panicky and he's not. That's why. He's picking up some bargain. Now, we can get through this thing all right.
All right. He just said a big word, panic, right? That's what that is. It's a panic at the bank. Okay. Not a panic at the disco, but a panic at the bank. So that's what used to happen. People used to run to the bank. So you think about what happened here last March in April when we literally went on a 2-week lockdown where they said you can't, we don't even want you to go outside, which looking back now, it's like, oh, that's crazy. But that's what we did. Okay. In 1929 and 1930, man, people would have been at their banks that day. They'd have been freaking out because they would have thought for sure that their bank was going to fail. But we don't worry about that at all in today's world. And part of that is because the government, our federal government, set up programs to prevent that from happening. That's what the FDIC is. When we get to the New Deal, you'll hear more about it. But the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Okay. So panics, thing of the past, but they happened during the Great Depression all the time. Banks foreclosed. And again, if you had your money in the bank and it foreclosed, it's gone. Okay. My grandma, she died in 1993, but she lived through this Great Depression. When she died, my dad and his brothers and sisters went to clean out her apartment, which is over by Althoff on the west end of Belleville. And they were cleaning it out. They were cleaning out the refrigerator, and my aunt reached in the freezer and pulled out socks, like old athletic socks that were like this high. They were like stacked up like this. They were $20 bills. My grandma had a bank account because my dad made her get one because he told her that you don't have to worry about the banks crashing anymore. But my grandma lived through the Great Depression. She lived through bank panics, and she did not put all of her money in the bank. She literally stored her cash in the freezer until the day she died because she was afraid that the banks were going to collapse on her and the banks were going to fail. And if the banks ever failed, she had money in the freezer, okay, to get by. I know that sounds crazy, but that's a true story. Okay, so fourth reason, right? Economic danger signs. There are too many goods and too little demands. This is called overproduction. And Henry Ford was awesome, okay? And he made the assembly line and the Model T, and that was great, and it worked for Henry Ford. But for other companies that were like, hey, we can mass produce our products and make more, and we'll just keep selling them. They learned, because this was kind of new, right? This kind of industrialization was new to America. They learned that you can't produce, just continue to produce and people purchase. Like eventually people get tired of them, right? Like you think about fads, right, that come and go, like the latest pair of Jordans, right, or a pair of Jordans from 10 years ago that now nobody wants, right? Those are old. Okay, so if you would even Jordans, if you would mass produce a brand new pair of Jordans, right? Well, they wouldn't cost $250. They would cost $75 because there'd be so many of them, right? You produce too many of something and the price goes down. Well, that was an economic danger sign that was out there. So when you combine all this stuff, okay, the uneven prosperity, the too many goods, the overproduction, right? The speculation and buying on margin and the stock market crash, right? The get rich quick schemes. You put all this together and it all kind of implodes at the same time. You get something like the Great Depression. Okay, so another economic danger sign was the farmers, because you want your farmers to be economically successful. During the war, our farmers were doing great. There was huge demand because not only did they have to feed everybody in America, they had to feed the soldiers overseas, and they had to feed the Allied soldiers overseas. So they were making money big time. So they took their money and they invested. Okay, they bought new tractors. They bought all this stuff to produce an enormous amount of food. But then the demand goes down because those people come back and we don't have to feed Europe anymore. Okay, so it becomes an issue because they've produced so much food, but there's not as many people to feed. Okay, of course, this is a day you'll need to know. Okay, and it's a biggie. This is the stock market crash in 1929 that started the Great Depression. So that I'll go back and summarize real quick. So you have buying on margin, right, is one of the reasons why the Great Depression happened. You have uneven prosperity is another reason. Okay, you have people buying on credit and getting overextended personally. Okay, the stock market and people putting too much in there and gambling too much, even though it was only 4 million Americans in that rock that hit the pond. Okay, people panicking and run to the banks. The banks weren't secure. Okay, there were too many goods and too little demand, right? Assembly lines had produced too much stuff and the farmers were hurting. Okay, those are all economic danger signs and they all crumbled at the same time.